If you have any issues or problems hearing us or seeing the presentation on the screen, please send us a chat message and we will try to see if we can address it. My name is Ji-Hei Choi from the UNFCCC Secretariat. I am part of the Mitigation and Transparency Support Unit, which provides support to developing countries in MRV and transparency issues, including through the consultative group of experts in implementing its work program. First, let me quickly provide you background of this webinar. This webinar is being organized as part of the hands-on training workshop for the African region, which will take place in September from 16th to 18th in Algeria. This workshop and webinar is being organized under the work program of the Consultative Group of Experts, or the CGE. The CGE, when it was formulating its work plan for this year, they wanted to focus on data issues, basically on institutionalizing data management for national greenhouse gas inventory. And this was in response to the findings out of the capacity building needs assessment that we conducted. In general, during the assessment process, there were two messages that came out quite clearly, and both were in relation to data issues. First, there were a lot of issues relating to primary data collection, and that issue seems to manifest in multiple ways. For example, a lack of access to data and unavailability of data itself, and also in some cases, even when there is data, it is either in inappropriate format or there are some quality issues. Second kind of issue relating to data seems to be around data management. Either there is lack of human resource capacity or technical infrastructure that can support data management. So given these issues that most countries have encountered, the CGE wanted to focus its technical assistance and capacity building activities on this data issue. As a result, we have put together a program which now includes webinar and hands-on training workshop. This webinar will provide the scene and also basis for the in-person workshop, and that's why in the invitation letter we had clearly indicated that it is prerequisite for the nominated experts to participate in this webinar. Without spending too much time on this, let me go into the agenda for today. In this webinar, we will address three parts. First part is around UNFCCC process. There will be presentation on what are the existing MRV arrangements in place and what you can expect from the enhanced transparency framework. And then we will provide a snapshot of how the Africa as a region is doing in terms of existing MRV arrangements, and also what are the key capacity building activities that are being rolled out and also planned for this year. After the presentation, we will have a short round of Q&A session, and then we will move into the second technical part of the webinar, which will be on greenhouse gas inventory and key data types and sources. For these two parts of technical session, we have two distinguished colleagues here as resource persons. The first part will be taken up by Ms. Sandra Motwanedi. She's sitting CGE member from South Africa. And just to briefly introduce her, she works for the Department of Environmental Affairs of South Africa and mainly engaged in MRV transparency area. She is part of the delegation in climate change negotiations, especially focusing on transparency. And she has managed the compilation, finalization, and publication of national reports from South Africa, including the first and second and third biannual update reports, and also third national communication. She's also on the roster of experts, and her expertise is on analysis of mitigation actions and associated effects. And then the second part of this webinar will be taken up by Dr. Olia Glade. She is the Director for MRV Systems at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. She has vast experiences working in the areas of MRV, especially national greenhouse gas inventories, natural science, and education. and she has designed greenhouse gas data management systems to the Institute. Previously, she was the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory focal point at the UNFCCC and the inventory compiler of the New Zealand. Also, she served as an energy sector expert and an expert journalist and lead reviewer for the inventories, national communications, and biennial reports to the UNFCCC. We are very honored to have two experts in the field to take us through this session. So finally, before we close the session, I will give you a quick snapshot of what you can expect from the 3-day hands-on training workshop. And just for your information, we have circulated this presentation in French. Due to technology issues, we were not able to put in place simultaneous translation for this session. But for the in-person workshop, we will have the English-French translation service. And of course, for the Q&A session, if you prefer, you can address your questions in French. We have a colleague here who can help us with the translation. For the questions, please send us your questions through the chat box or a dedicated Q&A box, which you can find in the little bubble tab at the bottom of the WebEx window. With that, may I invite Sandra to take us through the first part of today's session, please?
Thank you, Gia. Thanks everybody and everybody who has joined the session. As Gia has already introduced, I'm Sandra from South Africa, and I'll just give a presentation on MRV and transparency. What are the existing arrangements on MRV at the moment? From an international perspective, we have the national communication, in which we report on greenhouse gas inventories, as well as the steps that are taken by countries to implement the convention. And this is outlined in Decision 17 CP8, which contains the guidelines for the preparation of national communications for parties not included in Annex 1 of the convention. We also have the biennial update reports, which focuses on reporting on mitigation actions and effects, including the inventory, as well as the reporting on domestic MRV systems and support needed and received. And the guidelines for the preparation of biennial update report are contained in Annex 3 of Decision 2, CP17. And as we know, biennial update reports are subjected to an international consultation and analysis process. And during this process, there are two key steps where firstly, there's the technical analysis of biennial update reports. And once that has been finalized through the summary report, then the second part, which is the facilitative sharing of views, where parties present their BURs during the COP and the SBI session. And the modalities and guidelines for the ICA process are contained in Decision 2 CP17 as well as 20 CP19. For domestic MRV, the countries can determine their domestic MRV for their domestically supported numbers, and this is part of Decision 21 CP19. And they can also report on their domestic MRV arrangements in their biennial update report. And obviously, as I've already explained, these biennial update reports go through an international MRV process, including the ICA process. And also countries who choose to voluntarily report on the MRV of RED+, they can report their results in the technical annex to their BUR, and this BUR will follow the same process as other BURs, go through the ICA. And this is contained in Decision 14, CP19. Next slide, please. In terms of the Paris Agreement, what are the objectives of the Paris Agreement? There are key three objectives of the Paris Agreement. The first one being holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as well as pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And there's also the second objective to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience, as well as low greenhouse gas emissions development in a method that does not threaten food production. And obviously, then there has the financial flows have to be made available that are consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions as well as climate resilient development. So this is kind of divided into two parts where you have actions where you do your mitigation and your adaptation, and then you have means of implementation to enable the countries to be able to implement their mitigation actions and adaptation actions through finance, technology development and transfer, as well as capacity building. And in so doing, in so implementing the Paris Agreement, there has to be accountability. There's accountability through the enhanced transparency framework, the transparency of action and support, where countries become very transparent in terms of what they're doing to implement their NDCs and tracking progress thereof, as well as the support that they provide to the developed countries or the support that they've received and they need, if it's the developing countries. And there's also the global stocktake, which takes into account the aggregated level from all the countries that report under the transparency framework. And then we also have the compliance mechanism, which facilitates implementation and compliance. Thank you. Next slide, please. So basically, the next slide is more or less a repetition of what I was saying. You have action through mitigation and adaptation, and you have means of implementation, and then you have to account for all of that through the transparency framework, and then that also fits into the global stocktake. The aggregated contribution from different countries that informs the science in that global stocktake, and that also helps us to determine how we are doing as the world in terms of achieving the long-term temperature goal. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'm moving towards the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. Where are we at the moment? Currently, we're in 2019. For the developed countries, they have to submit their final biennial reports no later than 31 December 2022. After that, the enhanced transparency framework replaces the biennial report as well as the international assessment and review. And then for the developing countries, they will submit their final biennial update reports by no later than 31 December 2022. And then the enhanced transparency framework will replace the biennial update reports as well as the international consultation and analysis process. And then currently there's ongoing work under the SAPSTA to develop the common reporting tables, the common tabular formats, as well as the outlines for the biennial transparency reports, the national inventory document, and the technical expert review report. This work should be completed by November 2020. After that, in 2024, that is when all countries will have to start submitting their biennial transparency reports, and they should be submitted at least by the 31st of December 2024. Of course, the LDCs and CIS can submit their biennial transparency reports at their own discretion. And then the technical expert review will be initiated immediately following submission of a biennial update report, biennial transparency report, as well. And then the facultative multilateral consideration of progress will kick off as soon as the technical expert review report has been published. Currently, under the convention, there's the reporting that will still continue. The developed countries will still continue to submit their annual greenhouse gas inventories. They'll still continue to submit their national communications. Developing countries will also continue with their national communications if they wish to do so. And then it's worth noting that in the enhanced transparency framework, flexibility has been granted to those developing countries that needed in light of their capacities. And this also facilitates improved reporting as well as transparency over time. Next slide, please. In terms of the transparency framework, Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, transparency of action and support, there are shall provisions and other should provisions. So in terms of reporting, all parties, including both developing and developed countries, shall submit their national greenhouse gas inventory reports. They shall also report on the progress that they've made in implementing and achieving their targets in their nationally determined contributions. And in terms of reporting on adaptation, this is a should requirement. So countries can report on their climate change impacts and adaptation. However, this is not a shall requirement, as the other ones is a should requirement. And then also for developed countries, they also have another shall requirement to provide information on the support that they have provided in terms of financial, technology transfer, and capacity building. Developing countries should also report on the support needed and received. However, this is a should requirement for developing countries. And in terms of some of the overlaps with the current system in the biennial update reports, as we know that developing countries report on their national greenhouse gas inventory, they also have a shall requirement to report on mitigation actions and effects, which sort of overlaps with the progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs under the enhanced transparency framework. And also developing countries currently in their BURs do report on support needed and received, which sort of also has some similarities with the information that has to be submitted under the enhanced transparency framework. Also, once the biennial transparency reports have been submitted, they will then be subjected to a technical expert review process. The information that is going to be reviewed for developing countries will be the information on the greenhouse gas inventory, as well as the information on tracking the implementation of the NDC. And for developed countries, the information that they provide on support provided, that information will also be subjected to a technical expert review process. And in terms of similarities, this process of the technical expert review builds on the current international consultation and analysis process that is currently in place under the current MRV arrangements, particularly the technical analysis process. And then there's a process that is similar to the facilitative sharing of views under the enhanced transparency framework, which is called the multilateral facultative consideration of progress. And this is the process that all biennial transparency reports will also be subjected to. Thank you. Next slide, please. In comparing the MRV arrangements with the significant changes that have been introduced under the enhanced transparency framework, in terms of national greenhouse gas inventories, it's mandatory for all parties to use the 2006 IPCC guidelines. In terms of the latest inventory year, it should not be more than 2 years prior to the year of submission. However, developing countries have the flexibility to submit an inventory that is no more than 3 years prior to the year of submission. That is the developing countries that need the flexibility in light of their capacity. In terms of the time series, all parties shall provide a consistent annual time series starting from 1990. However, if those developing countries that need flexibility in light of their capacities have the flexibility to at least start reporting from the NDC reference year or period, as well as a consistent annual time series from 2020 onwards. And where it's needed, all parties are required to perform the necessary recalculations and to do all the completeness checks. In terms of reporting, all parties shall report all the 7 gases. However, Those developing countries that need flexibility in terms of their capacities can at least report the three gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Tracking progress of implementation and achievement of the NDC. There's information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs under as it is under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. And in providing this information, this will include information on the country-specific indicators for the country to track their NDC, their accounting approaches, their greenhouse gas emissions and removal, consistent with the coverage of their NDCs, as well as the contributions from the land sector and the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes as they currently are under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And then also they have to also report a summary of greenhouse gas emissions and removals, as well as greenhouse gas projections. But there are some flexibilities for developing countries in terms of reporting on greenhouse gas projections. Thank you. Next slide, please. In terms of the information on climate change impacts and adaptation, the information is mostly similar to what the countries are currently reporting under the national communications. There just some differences in the structure, and also now parties can also report on information on loss and damage under the adaptation component. In terms of support needed and received, this information can be both qualitative and quantitative. And then under the enhanced transparency framework, this information is well structured. It has got modularity and over 20 parameters or provisions which are much more which provide much more granular information. Also, there are other parties that provide support that should also provide this information on support provided in terms of finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. For example, you may have those developing countries that are also providing support to other developing countries. So these countries should also provide this information. Thank you. Next slide. In terms of the technical expert review process, the information that is to be reviewed in the biennial transparency report as the information on the national greenhouse gas inventory, the information on tracking progress towards the implementation and achievement of the NDC under Article 4, as well as for developed countries on support provided. And for the first biennial transparency report that is to be submitted by a party, that first biennial transparency report shall undergo an in-country review. However, the developing countries that need flexibility in light of their capacities may request for their first BTRs to instead undergo a centralized review. And then there's also a new concept that has been introduced, the concept of a simplified review, which is just more or less once the BTR has been reviewed, it's just being checked against, the general compliance with the guidelines. It's not really an in-depth review of the BTR. In terms of facilitative multilateral consideration of views, efforts under Article 9 and its respective implementation and achievement of the NDC. This process will take place as soon as the technical expert review report has been finalized. However, there could be exceptions to this. For an example, in the case where a technical expert review does not become available within 12 months of submitting the biennial transparency report. Also, if a party does not submit a biennial transparency report within 12 months from 21 December 2024, which means by 2025, 20 December, if still a party has not submitted its biennial transparency report, then that's when there could be an exception to this process. Thank you. Next slide, please. How are the countries doing in terms of reporting goals with their national communications and biennial update reports? That's the picture that we see there. Most countries have submitted the first national communication. In Africa, second national communication, third national communication. In Africa, no country has yet submitted the fourth national communication. In Asia Pacific region, there are two fourth national communications. In the Eastern Europe and Western Europe, as well as the other states, at least there's one fourth national communication. And in the Latin American countries, there are at least two fourth national communications. Also, okay, I've been asked to slow down a bit. I'll try my best. Also, within the Latin American region, there's a country that has also submitted the sixth national communication. I think it's Mexico. And then in terms of biennial update reports, in terms of biennial update reports in Africa, about 9 countries have submitted their biennial update reports. 4 have submitted their second biennial update report, and only 2 have submitted their third biennial update report. And I'm pleased to say of those 2, South Africa is one of those. I think it's South Africa together with Namibia. So in terms of the regional picture for Africa, Africa is still not doing so well in submitting the biennial update report. And I'm sure it could be to some of the challenges and constraints gaps that Gia mentioned at the beginning of when she was doing the introduction. Looking into the other regions as well, you can see in the Asia Pacific, 14 first BURs, 9 second BURs, only 1 third BUR. I think you can also relate to the picture in the other regions as well. Thank you. Next slide, please. In terms of submitting BUR and participating in the international consultation and analysis process, this is the regional perspective. 9 countries in Africa have submitted their first biennial update reports, and of those 9, 8 have 8 of them have a technical analysis summary report finalized. And let's see, about 8 of them have already gone through the first facilitative sharing of views session. And so the picture goes on and on and on. Also for the second biennial update report, 4 of them, and then you have 3 technical analysis summary reports for the second biennial update report, and 3 countries that have gone their second facilitative sharing of views session. Also, for an example, I think Namibia and South Africa, because they are already on their third BUR. And so the picture goes for the other regions as well. Thanks, Gia. Next slide, please. In terms of the latest greenhouse gas inventory report here included in the latest submissions from African countries, at least there's one African country that has submitted the greenhouse gas inventory for 2016. There are about 4 that have submitted a greenhouse gas inventory, with the latest year being 2015, and about 2 with 2014 being the latest year. So as you can see, and we still have about 1 which has in the inventory for 1994, and about 18 for the inventory of 1999. So there's still information from South Africa which is not as recent as we would like to see, probably because of the fact that most of the African countries are still to submit their biennial update reports, which obviously require countries to submit a greenhouse gas inventory, which is at least not more than 4 years behind the year of submission. So I'm thinking if more biennial update reports could come from African countries, then we could at least have more recent greenhouse gas inventories from the African countries. Thanks, Gia. Next slide, please. In terms of the number of African countries that report key sectors in their latest greenhouse gas inventory reports, if you look at 50 being the total of the countries, all countries do report on the energy sectors, all countries do report on the agricultural sector, all countries do report on land use change and forestry as well as waste. To some extent, about 45 report on industrial processes and only about 2 that have reported on solvent and other product use. Thanks, Gia. Next slide, please. In terms of reporting on total greenhouse gas emissions, excluding land use change and forestry, or land use change and forestry, as expressed as a percentage per sector for the year 2010, some country examples there. For an example, the Central African Republic, for their 2010 inventory, they had 93.14% of the emissions coming from the agricultural sector, and a little bit of 5.16% coming from the energy sector. Looking into the example of Kenya, also the agricultural sector emissions were the most dominant ones at 59.18%, with the energy sector being second at 32.63%, and also small contributions from industrial processes sectors as well as the waste sectors. Also, Madagascar also has a very large percentage of emissions coming from the agricultural sector, 10.78% coming from the energy sector, a little bit from industrial processes and waste. Also, Mali, for their 2010 inventory, also agricultural sector emissions being the dominant ones, and then followed by energy at 7.5%, and obviously small contributions from waste and industrial processes. So these are countries that have a very high percentage of their emissions coming from the agricultural sector, which means that this is the sector that they could target in terms of maybe reducing their emission reduction. Thanks, Gia. Next slide, please. What has been the capacity building efforts in the African regions for the year 2019? On the left, you'll see some of the events or the capacity building activities or workshops, and as well as the host countries or the countries in which they occurred and the date. For an example, for Cluster Francophone Regional Workshop on Inventories and Mitigation Options in the Waste and Offal sectors. This took place in February in Senegal. A workshop on building sustainable national greenhouse gas inventory management systems, the use of 2006 IPCC guidelines for the African region. This workshop took place in the Seychelles in March, and I think there was also an information methods project with the Eswatini government, where they were looking into the training on greenhouse gas inventories and mitigation options in the waste sector. There's also a quality assurance exercise of our national greenhouse gas inventory as South Africa that we did with the UNFCCC Secretariat. This took place in April in Pretoria in South Africa. And so they go on. There's been another information matters in project or rather activity for mitigation options in the waste sector in Algeria. And then there was one in Malawi, the quality assurance of the national inventory system for Malawi. I think this one was done for Malawi, similar to the one that was done for South Africa. And also the two other ones that took place in October in Ghana. Thanks, Gia. Next slide, please. In conclusion, what's the conclusion here? True to the Paris spirit, the enhanced transparency framework goals and enhances the existing MRV arrangement. So because the enhanced transparency framework goals and enhances the existing MRV arrangements, the current existing MRV arrangements, they provided a perfect opportunity for parties to do a dry run of the enhanced transparency framework. In other words, it's good for countries to start participating in the MRV arrangements, to start preparing their biannual update reports so that they can sort of test themselves in terms of how ready they are for the enhanced transparency framework. So in this regard, parties are encouraged to continue preparing their biennial update reports as well as participating in the international consultation and analysis process. The focus on enhancing institutional arrangements. In focusing on institutional arrangements, the requirements stemming from the enhanced transparency framework need to be kept fully in sight. So in other words, when countries are really enhancing and strengthening their institutional arrangements, they must always keep in mind and align that to the enhanced transparency framework, which will then take effect after the current MRV arrangements, because come December 2024, all parties by then are expected to have submitted their first biennial transparency report. So there are a number of success stories to draw inspiration from. Also, ownership is very important. It's also very imperative to have domestic political buy-in. It's important to get access to support to enable countries to be able to do this work. And this will continue to be such factors continue to be very essential ingredients for the successful implementation of the enhanced transparency framework. And with that, I think I've come to the end of my presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I would welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. That was very nice, detailed explanation on the MRV and also enhanced transparency framework arrangements. Now, we have received few questions from the floor. I think I would suggest to take up those 3 questions now, and before moving on to the next part of this session. And also after that, if you have any more questions relating to this first part of the presentation, you can keep sending us those questions, and we can maybe take up those questions after the second part of the presentations. So I think I can just read out loud all those questions. But first 2 questions both of them are relating to the inventory year. So first question is from Liberia. So if Liberia is submitting the national greenhouse gas inventory this year, what should be the last inventory year? And also we are working on submitting the first BUR this year with inventory taken from 2015 to 2018. And also these biannual update reports will be submitted in December 2019. So should it contain the greenhouse gas inventory for which year? So that was first question relating to inventory report year. And also, I think I can also share the second question, which is from Egypt colleague, which is also relating to the inventory year. So Egypt is preparing the national greenhouse gas inventory using taking this inventory year from 2016 to 2017. But the country is expecting to finish their report or to submit the report around 2022. So if there is any implication, whether to use other inventory year, or what would you suggest to prepare this inventory year? So that was the first two questions relating to the inventory year, and there were another question. Let me just read it. What is the main reason of changing from MRV arrangements to the enhanced transparency framework in the Paris Agreement? So, Sandra, I hope you got all the questions clear, and if you can just give us some answers, that would be great.
Okay. Thank you, Gia. In terms of the first question from Liberia on the inventory, so the biennial update report guidelines requires parties to submit an inventory that is not more than 4 years behind the year of submission, which means when you're submitting in 2019, at least you should have an inventory for the year 2015, because it becomes 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. However, if a party can submit a more recent inventory, that is even better for that country, because as you know, under the enhanced transparency framework, parties have to submit an inventory that is not more than 2 years behind the year of submissions, though the developing countries can submit those that need flexibility in light of their capacities can submit an inventory that is 3 years behind the year of submission. So I think if Liberia intends to submit its BUR in 2019, and they have an inventory for 2000 to 2018, that is really so much better, and that puts it in a very, very good position to sort of test itself to be able to comply with the requirements under the enhanced transparency framework. The one for Egypt, 2017. Okay, 2022, I think 2022 will probably, if my calculation is correct, it's 5 years, which is not in compliance with the guidelines, and it's something that will obviously be raised during the technical analysis of that BUR. Of course, if that is still okay, but I think the country could then maybe in their BUR maybe explain any challenges maybe that they face in not being able to report an inventory that is not more than 4 years behind the year of submission. Just also to relate to this, also with our second biennial update report, we submitted one which was 5 years behind because we had some internal challenges like staff turnovers, which led to the delay of the submission of the BUR, which then affected the inventory that was submitted with that BUR. So we also made this aware to the technical team of experts when they were doing the analysis, and we also sort of put this in our biennial update report upfront when we were submitting it, so that we made it clear that we are aware of this, and this was due to such challenges. So that would be my input on that one. In terms of the motivation from moving from MRV to the enhanced transparency framework, and this was a decision by the parties. As you know, in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about those three objectives of the Paris Agreement of limiting the temperature increase to 2 degrees, and also strengthening efforts to limiting it to 1.5 degrees. Also, having the actions to achieve this, through mitigation and adaptation. So, and also, as you know, and also having the means of implementation to achieve these actions. So with that, countries have to be held accountable. So that is why you have the existence now of the enhanced transparency framework, where because in the Paris Agreement, countries have their own nationally determined contributions, where countries have set targets for themselves. And now they have to now account that, okay, myself as a country, these are the targets that I've set for myself, and this is how I am doing towards the achievement of those targets. So that is why you have the enhanced transparency framework for countries to become accountable for the targets that they've set themselves under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. Also, it's important for that information from all parties to go into the global stocktake so that we can see what is the overall effort and the overall impact of, of reducing emissions or adapting to climate change from all countries. And this is very important for informing the science in order for us to know whether we are on track really in terms of achieving the long-term temperature goal. So if countries do not report, then we are not able to measure whether we are really on target to achieving the long-term temperature goal that we've set ourselves under the Paris Agreement. So that is really some of the reasons why we were able to, why parties had decided that, okay, let's move from the current MRV arrangements into the enhanced transparency framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for providing such clarification and insights to the questions received. Just before moving on to the next part, I have received some messages from few participants that they, from time to time, lost the connections. We are recording the session so that we can share this recording with you for your future reference as well. So we hope to be able to circulate this whole material to you in the coming few days. But in the meantime, please stay with us so that once the connection is back, you can also participate in this interactive discussion as well. With that remark, I think we are ready to move on to the next session, which will be technical session on the greenhouse gas inventories. So Olia, may I have now invite Olia now?
Thank you, Jihai, and welcome everyone to National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. We will speak today about key data types and sources for reporting greenhouse gas inventories. So effective mitigation of climate change requires a clear understanding of greenhouse gas emissions and their sources, and regular monitoring of mitigation strategies and their impacts. The practice of MRV, which integrates three independent but related processes of measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is a fundamental thing in this regard. The first MRV process is measurement or monitoring. Why would it be so? Simply because you can't change what you can't measure. That's true whether you are talking about losing weight, improving your race time, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to climate action, efficient and effective measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions and emission reductions is critical to help countries understand greenhouse gas sources and trends, design mitigation strategies and adaptation guidance, and also enhance credibility and take other policy actions. This may entail direct physical measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, estimating emissions or emission reductions, calculating changes relevant to sustainable development, and collecting information about support for climate change mitigation. Ultimately, measurement and monitoring aim to provide a reliable base and solid factual background for transparency reporting and guide decision-making. Next slide, please. Reporting has the main purpose of making the information accessible to a range of stakeholders and citizens, and to facilitate informed choices and decision-making. Some examples of reporting may include compiling greenhouse gas inventories, calculating projections, and creating some other reports in standardized formats, for example, national adaptation plans. Also, it includes evaluation of effectiveness of measures and policy interventions. Next slide, please. Verification process aims to ensure that the data and information acquired during measurement or monitoring process is credible, reliable, and robust. It usually includes independent assessments and evaluations that create accountability and provide feedback and ultimately facilitate improvement of our data. Some examples of verification are independent reports based on parallel data sets, trying to verify calculations by using different models and methods, and performing parallel and independent evaluations. You can think of using top-down or bottom-up or reference approach to calculate energy emissions, for example, comparing the results obtained from applying Tier 1 and Tier 2 methods, and calculating emissions by comparison different emission factors using the IPCC default range and country-specific emission factors. Next slide, please. As you can see, MRV covers a wide spectrum of actions and certainly includes manipulations with large volumes of information and big data sets. That is why, to ensure the quality and efficiency of MRV work, it is a good idea to apply systemic thinking and use reliable and robust information systems. These do not necessarily require expensive arrays of cray computers. In fact, first and outmost, they require a clear understanding of data requirements, organization and information flows, and the processes that are involved in the information processing. Then, some or all of it could be formalized and computerized depending on the needs of each particular country. Looking at the MRV landscape from this angle, we can identify three basic components that underpin key data types and information flows. As you can see in the slide, the greenhouse gas associated data and processes are only a part of this landscape, and thus represent just one component of a climate MRV information management system. First, greenhouse gas data is just one component, so remember that, please. You also have information and data related to finance, support, adaptation, mitigation policies, etc. We'll consider all of this in details later at the workshop. Next slide, please. As Sandra mentioned earlier, MRV process can operate at different levels, which means that data collection should reflect this structure and be done at national, sectoral, facility, or project level. Next slide, please. With signing the Paris Agreement, the total approach to MRV has been changed. First of all, it became more global. The world has become one climate change family where everyone contributes to the good of all. This drastically changed the breadth of activities and consolidated efforts in dealing with the effects of climate change. In turn, it gave a strong push towards strengthening institutional and management systems to control and confront effects of climate change and support mitigation and prioritizing resources and tools that could be of help to do so. Consequently, it required a wider pool of knowledgeable and skillful people to be involved in the climate change action, and thus intensified the need in setting up and further development of the relevant educational system. Now we will make the next step in understanding the core part of climate data management systems that would help us to be fast and efficient in our MRV work. Next slide, please. As you know, to get the best tool for the job, first you have to figure out exactly what you need, how you'd use it, and if you can afford it. Translating this simple wisdom into a project language, here is what we need to do. We need to establish specific data output objectives, meaning what do we want to achieve in the end. Next, we need to broadly define a shopping list for the system, that is the scope to the system, or what it will cover and what it will not. Next, we will make a more detailed list of technical requirements for the system's functionality, that is, what exactly it is you need the system to do. Then, we will couple the requirements with institutional arrangements to make sure that what the system is going to do is agreed with all relevant people and agencies that would be involved in systems work, one way or the other. Everyone knows their roles and responsibilities in relation to the system and agreed to perform them. This is a vital thing. Without it, none of the systems will work, whether it's computerized or not. Finally, we will confirm staffing and funding for development and operation so that you are not run out of money halfway through. As we already have a pretty good idea what our data objectives are, and these are more or less defined for the Katowice rulebook and will be no doubt further refined, our next step is to define system scope and its basic user requirements. Next slide, please. There are lots of things that data management systems can do. During the coming workshop in September, you will discuss this to a greater detail. For now, let me show you a few examples to give you a good start. For instance, the scope of the system could include aggregation and storage of activity data, emission vectors, and parameters. It could also include analysis of emissions output. It may include documentation of overall QA and QC procedures and their outcomes. If you're lucky, it might be a generation of UNFCCC and other reports. It is important that the system would include archiving of datasets, calculations, and supporting documentation so that they are available on a short notice when you need to review your work or make some improvements. Next slide, please. Here I'm giving you a few examples of MRV systems at work. On the left side, you can see a complex example from the United States of America designed by Environmental Protection Authority. This is only a small part of the inventory national arrangement system for the energy sector in the USA. The second example on the right shows a more generalized framework in Tanzania. You probably noticed that both diagrams could be further improved, and that goes far beyond the graphic representation. For example, in the US EPA diagram, it is not clear who submits the data on mobile combustion to 5 different agencies in the first place, or which company or agency collects the data about coal mining. So these particular areas could benefit from some further thinking. An example from Tanzania, it is not clear whether the sector experts reside at the various government agencies, for example, Ministry of Energy, and what their role is. For example, do they do the data collection from the external providers, or they do preliminary data processing, or they calculate emissions from each sector and write the reports, or maybe they do all of the above. When you are drawing such diagrams for your countries, for your homework, I encourage you to ask yourself all these questions. Who does the action? Where does the data flow? Where the input is coming from? Where will output go to? Make sure that the diagram of institutional arrangement tells your story to other people, and think, how could you make it as simple and as informative as possible? Next slide, please. Now, there are several layers of data that are relevant to GHG reporting. I just introduced you to the first one that describes the institutional arrangements for GHG reporting. The arrangements enable to govern the data collection, processing, and sharing our information with other countries. Now we move towards the next layer, which presents the fundamental part of GHG reporting, the activity data, without which calculation of emissions would not be possible. So why is the data collection an important part of GHG inventory compilation? First of all, data collection is an integral part of developing and updating a GHG inventory, which underpins many mitigation processes, actions, and reports, and enable forecasting emissions in the future, as well as informing policy and decision-making for different components of MRV. Secondly, it is an IPCC good practice to establish formalized data collection activities that should be adopted by national circumstances and reviewed periodically. Next, data collection producers are necessary for finding and processing existing data, as well as for generating new data by surveys or measurement campaigns. Please note that data collection should cover values and their uncertainties, because we need to be aware how trustworthy our data are and where we can improve them. Next slide, please. So what are the key data types needed to estimate greenhouse gas emissions? Considering the most basic method for estimating emissions as the simple product of activity data by emission sector, the key data types associated with estimating emissions would include activity data, emission sector, and of course emissions themselves. An inventory is characterized by the following parameters. Parameter 1. The chemical and physical identity of greenhouse gases emitted or sequestered. Direct greenhouse gases that are reported in the inventories include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons known as HFCs, perfluorocarbons referred to as PHCs, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. There is also a physical characteristic of different greenhouse gases known as global warming potential, or GWP. GWPs are associated with an ability of gases to trap the heat reflected by the Earth's surface and prevent it from escaping into space, and thus causing the additional warming effect, which is something we are fighting. The measure between incoming and outgoing energy is known as radiative forcing. IPCC defines global warming potentials as the cumulative radiative forcing over a specified time horizon resulting from the emission of a unit mass of gas related to a reference gas, which is currently a carbon dioxide. In other words, GWP shows how many metric tons of carbon dioxide has to be emitted to achieve the same effect as 1 metric ton of a given gas, for example, methane. The list of global warming potentials is constantly updated as the science moves forward. Methane GWP right now is 25. Nitrous oxide has it at 298. Among GHGs currently reported in the inventories, sulfur hexafluoride has the strongest GWP. The value is astronomical, 22,800, and in the next IPCC assessment report it will become even bigger. So the second parameter that is used for the inventory data is the sector or an activity source that causes emissions and removals. The IPCC guidelines give guidance for estimating emissions from each of sectors and categories. The third parameter includes the location of emissions and removals, geography. It is a mandatory requirement that the inventories include a complete geographical coverage for each country. Finally, parameter 4 includes the time period over which emissions and removals are estimated. For the greenhouse gas inventories, we are talking about the period of 1 year. so it's annual estimates. Each of those parameters have supporting or documentation metadata. For example, the year data were collected, the method for data collection, calculated uncertainty, assumptions made for collection of data, and classification of methods, and many, many others. We will talk about it more during the workshops. Now, how do we collect this data? What does it require? For each source and emission and removals, the IPCC guidelines have a section describing the choice of emission sector and the choice of activity data. So that's where we can get that useful information from. Next slide, please. The typical cycle of data management throughout inventory includes 6 phases. At the moment, we'll focus on the data collection. However, I'll briefly run through the first 3, which are precursors of the data collection process. So we speak about starting the inventory, identifying key categories, and selecting methods. Next slide, please. Starting the inventory means that we will be clear about all the categories and sectors that we are counting the greenhouse gases from and reporting in the inventory. Greenhouse gas inventory includes all emissions and removals that take place within a specific boundary, which is a geographic boundary as well as sectoral boundary. We will focus on national inventories, but as mentioned earlier, others could also include the national, subnational, entity, and project level data. The principles of the inventory and inventory data include transparency, accuracy, consistency, comparability, and completeness. And again, we'll go to a greater detail on those during the workshops. The next important part here is identification of key categories. That is because you want to be efficient in compiling your inventories. You need to focus on main sources, on bigger sources of emissions and removals. The main 6 gases that I already mentioned include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, perfluoride carbons, and hydrofluorocarbons. However, they can be split between different sources. Carbon dioxide mostly is coming from transport, burning fossil fuels like coal, crude oil, diesel, petrol, etc. Methane usually comes from natural gas systems, landfills, and agriculture. Nitrous oxide from manufacturing, agriculture, and cars. Sulfur hexafluoride from electrical transmissions, magnesium production. Perfluorocarbons normally come from aluminium production, and hydrofluorocarbons, apart from being synthesized, can also be emitted from semiconducting manufacturing and, of course, from refrigeration and air conditioning. There are also indirect greenhouse gases, reporting of which is not mandatory, however advisable. Those include sulfur dioxide, different forms of nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and non-methane volatile organic compounds. Next, we go to key category analysis, which is also abbreviated as KCA. This analysis is a very important part of your inventory. It will help you to quantify those sources of emissions and removals, how significant they are, which ones comprise countries 95 or 85% and contribute to your whole emissions inventory. You can also think about the categories which are emerging the fastest and also categories which have the highest uncertainty to make sure you're planning your efforts on inventory efficiently. Next, we'll speak about selection of methods because they will define which data need to go into those methods. So we speak about methodological choice. For this, for each type of choice, you will need to collect the data at the different level and detail. Otherwise, the methods cannot be applied. Next slide, please. Now we move to collecting the data, which is the most critical and often most resource-demanding aspect of the inventory. Where can we get the data and who can be the data suppliers? It's the first and biggest question. Activity data are typically collected through statistical agencies, departments, and, for example, census actions. Universities could be good sources, industry associations or individual companies and farms, or laboratories or specialized organizations. For emission sectors, we could use IPCC guidelines because they provide default emission sectors. We can use research studies and expert judgment. We could think of international organizations, which are also a good source of information. We could look at inventories of the other countries. And also there is emission factor database provided by IPCC, where we could have a look at potential options for our emission factors. Next slide, please. Although there are different sources for data collection, the main thing here is to make sure that those sources actually provide the data that you need on demand. Therefore, the underpinning action here is to set up the correct legal, institutional, and procedural arrangements that would help you to make the process of inventory data collection smooth. You also will need to make sure that you know who is responsible for reporting, archiving emission data, and for quality assurance and control. This includes description of the procedures for the collection and documentation of data executed by different teams and agencies. Next slide, please. Now, here are the key principles to focus on when planning for data collection. First of all, focus on key categories. Think of largest emission sources, greatest potentials to change, highest uncertainties, and mitigation measures planned or implemented. Next, choose procedures that continuously improve the quality of the inventory. Then, collect the data at a level of detail which is appropriate to the method that you are going to use for emission estimates. Finally, review data collection activities and methodological needs on a regular basis because the situation in your country may change. You might have new technological and scientific developments that could be reflected in a better data and better processing of the data. In general, national data are always better than international because it's close to home. Peer-reviewed data, of course, better than the non-peer-reviewed because you want to be absolutely sure the data you're using are good. Direct data are better than surrogate, meaning the data which are directly used in the method recommended by IPCC are the best to use. But if they're not available, you could think of some other data that would help you to understand what the actual data could have been and how would they behave from year to year. Finally, it is a good idea to use publicly available data rather than confidential because you won't have too many barriers reporting it. Next slide, please. It is a good practice to engage data suppliers in the process of inventory compilation and improvement from the very beginning, as early as possible. This way, they will better understand your data needs. It is also a good idea to establish a formal memorandum of understanding or other mechanism to acquire data in the time frame appropriate for the GHG inventory on a continual basis rather than ad hoc. It is a really very good idea to communicate very clear requirements to the data. And of course, it is advisable to involve your data vendors into KMQC process. And last but not the least, it is very important to acknowledge them in the final report. Make sure they know that you are acknowledging them. To make sure that the collected data are exactly what you need, communicate very clearly the key data requirements. For example, they could include definition of data set, like data time series, sector, subsector detail, national coverage, requirement for uncertainty, emission factors, and activity data units, which is a very important parameter. Next, it's a good idea to define the format, for example, within a spreadsheet, and the structure for the data. Ask for specific tables so that it will be easier to process. Description of any assumptions is needed to make regarding national coverage and sectoral coverage included at the right year, to include technology and management level for emission estimates, to include the emission sectors, etc. So without assumptions, you don't know to what degree the data can be used and how far they can be extended. It's also important to identify the routines and timescales for data collection activities. For example, how often is the data set updated and what elements are updated within it? For example, you could think of censuses which are made once for 5 or 6 or sometimes even 10 years. You can think of livestock data collection that could be done every half year or every year, etc. Next slide, please. Of course, it's not a secret that there are barriers to data sharing and collection, and those could include technology problems, the fact that data could be expensive and difficult to collect or maintain. The data is also powerful and certainly not freely shared due to concerns of misuse or confidentiality. Also, effective data sharing includes metadata that describes how the data is organized, what the limitations are, and how to use it, that would help you to overcome some of the barriers. Next slide, please. Finally, I will give you a few suggestions of what can we do to overcome data sharing issues mentioned before. On the organizational side, I would suggest to set up in advance relevant contracts, memorandum of understanding, letters of endorsement, and other procedures to reach the agreement with your data suppliers, especially agreements concerning sensitivity of the data and sensitive data, procedures for maintaining data integrity, procedures for ensuring data quality, and set up strategies for ensuring data security. Also, it is important to set up routines for regular collection of informal updates. On the implementation side, I would suggest engage data suppliers in activities and do it as early as possible. For example, offer an initial estimate of emissions from the category so they know where to begin. Explain the intended use of the data so they understand what you want from them and why it is wanted. Cooperate with them to derive mutually acceptable data sets. For example, explain clearly which formats are needed, how you're going to process the data later so they will know why those formats are needed. Point out the potential high uncertainties of the data and make sure that they're aware of that. Collaborate with your providers in improving estimates. Make sure that they feel like a part of your team. Run scientific or statistical workshops to improve the understanding of data and data quality. And of course, I mentioned it before, give the credit and acknowledgement to your data providers in the inventory. Without them, the inventory wouldn't exist. Make sure that they know that ahead they have a nice international publication. That is what I wanted to tell you today. I will tell you more in the workshop time, and we will try to do things together using hands-on exercise, especially designed for you. Thank you very much for your attention and good luck with your inventories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olia, for outlining the process for the compilation of the greenhouse gas inventory, especially walk us through the basics or fundamentals for the data collection process. We have received a few questions from the floor. Those are actually mainly around, the first question is around what is the QA and QC procedures and what are the differences in between? That's the first question. And then let me just read out loud the other questions as well. The second question was what is the link between the institution arrangements for the greenhouse gas inventory database and also for the revision of the nationally determined contributions. Third question and fourth questions were mainly relating to the methods. One participant specifically asked for the basic methods that we can use in practice with the numbers. I think which this can be taken up at our hands-on exercise during the workshop, in-person workshop. And also the fourth question was also related to these methods. Let me just read it. Would it be acceptable if a data provider can measure the emission quantities directly with special equipment, let's say in industrial sector, IPPU? So that was the fourth question. And then fifth question was, in general, how long does it take to draft a MRV mechanism, beginning from the identification and assessment of different options and possibilities for domestic MRV? I hope I get the essence of this question correct. I think this expert is asking, in general, like what would be the process from beginning from the identification of the different options and also until the compilation or drafting or submitting the whole report. We have few other questions coming in, so if you can address these four questions already, then in the meantime I will also forward the questions that are coming in right now. Olia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so I'll start from the very beginning. So what are the QA and QC procedures and what's the difference between those? So the QA means quality assurance and QC means quality control. So I will begin from quality control. So these are the routine procedures which are performed by people and personnel who is involved in the inventory preparation during the entire inventory process. They're aiming to ensure the quality of data, measurements, quality of calculations, quality of the report, consistency between the calculations and what goes into report, etc. I can point you at a very good table in IPCC guidelines in volume 1. It's table number 6.1. That table shows the basic QC procedures that are recommended by IPCC as good practice. So I would suggest you would look at this and think how you can apply it for your particular country. Now, quality assurance procedures is something different. These procedures are aiming to ensure that the data are relevant. The methods are up to the recent technological achievements, that the chapters, the inventory chapters, are indeed having complete coverage, that the description of the methods is acceptable, comprehensive enough, and correct, etc. Those procedures are usually performed by the third party, not by personnel involved in inventory preparation. A more advanced version of quality assurance includes audits, whether the quality assurance exercises are in line with the quality control plan for the country and in line with IPCC guidelines. I will talk more about it during the workshops, but these are the basic key points. Right, so the next question is the link between institutional arrangement database and revision indices. So institutional arrangements are all possible arrangements that cover all data flows, all data processing mechanisms and activities. So they're pretty much agreements that clearly identify the roles and responsibilities, incomes and outcomes for each activity, procedure, and basic relationships between different organizations. So they underpin the entire process of inventory data collection and processing, as well as its reporting and publication. A revision of NDC is largely based on the inventory because the NDC indicators involve quite a lot of information from the inventory, and therefore setting up the appropriate institutional arrangements is instrumental to ensure that NDC indicators are estimated correctly based on up-to-date information, and the roles and responsibilities for those estimations are clearly defined and agreed by all parties. As for the third question, I agree. We will have some hands-on exercises associated with basic methods, especially in dealing with gaps in data collection. That will be there will be a presentation on this topic, and there will be hands-on exercise when the participants will do it themselves and ask all the questions related to it during the workshop. The next one is direct measurements for IPCC for hydrofluorocarbons acceptable for the inventory. Well, direct measurements are obviously acceptable for the inventory as long as they're appropriately documented, and if they are at low level, like plant specifics, and they are will be plant specific, if the quality of those measurements is observed and described in the inventory. So the key components here are: provide the values, explain how the measurements were done, and how the control of the data was set up and observed. So these are the three things that you need to know about. Right, I think I'm coming to the next question, which is quite big but interesting. How long does it take to draw the MRV mechanisms in relation to the inventory? Well, there are two different answers that I could give here. Drawing the MRV mechanism is the continuous process. You will have the first take on it when you prepare the first inventory. However, you will be constantly improving those mechanisms as your inventory matures and develops. So there is no specific endpoint for it in these terms. However, you can look at it from a different perspective. You can look at it from a perspective of inventory preparation cycle. So you will need to begin from evaluating and analyzing the experiences and lessons learned from creating the previous inventories that you diligently did during the compilation of biennial update reports and national communications. Those lessons learned will help you to identify the gaps and weaknesses that currently exist and would be nice to cover for the upcoming inventory reports. The other basis for the very, very first step in setting up institutional arrangement is, of course, checking the rules, what is required, what is expected, what is mandatory. Those rules can be taken from the Katowice rulebook. Once you have educated yourself on this, it's a good idea to have a meeting of all people, of all key stakeholders that are involved in inventory production, and explain and discuss those things with them. It is a good background, that discussion would be a good background to arrive to appropriate institutional arrangements in the country. To have more ideas about who should be involved in those institutional arrangements, it's a good idea to map the process of data flow from the very beginning, meaning data collection, to the very end, data submission, and see who might be involved, who need to be involved in those processes, and who will be approving the data movements from one point to another. So all of these have to be covered by institutional arrangements, and they need to be set up before any other activities in inventory begin, because otherwise people won't simply do those activities. Once the arrangements are put in place, then we go into the process of data collection. depending on the inventory system in the country, that data collection could be done by different private collectors, universities, agencies, or the central inventory agency itself. After data collection is performed, it needs to undergo the preliminary data processing. And again, this has to be governed by institutional arrangements because it has to be clear who is doing the preliminary data processing, who is making sure that the inputs and outputs of this are of good quality and in acceptable format for further processing. Once that activity data is collected and preliminarily processed, then you can think about putting them into the models that you use for emission estimation or into the tier 1 methods, or whichever methods and models are appropriate for your country. So all of this has to be governed again for institutional arrangements because it's not happening by itself. It's the people in the information systems and people who are looking after information systems who are involved in this process. So that's a combination situation. So it's quite a lot of things involved here. Finally, somebody has to control the quality of the output product of this big complex process. Once that is done, then the inventory can be drafted, so the inventory chapters can be written. And again, this needs to be governed by arrangements because the authors need to know in advance they have to draw those chapters. Somebody has to do the peer review of those chapters. Somebody has to look after editorials of those chapters and putting them together in one nice report ready for submission. And of course, in each country there is a approval processing mechanism. Often each stage of the inventory has to be signed off and approved by a certain entity. Those approvals have to be built in the institutional arrangements, and the dates or timeframes for those approvals have to be clearly set up so the inventory is not delayed because there is a delay in approval. A similar process has to be established for inventory publication and submission. So, well, for New Zealand, where I used to work, the process would take the entire year. From the day of submission, we begin the next cycle, and by the end of submission, the cycle finishes. So hopefully I answered that question as much as I could. If you have further details, if you want to know further details about it, we can talk in person during the workshop in Algiers. Thank you.
Thank you, Olia, for providing answers to those questions. And we have received a few other interesting questions. So I think we can use the rest of the time taking up these few questions. Okay, so one more question is relating to on the legal framework that you can use in terms of data sharing. If there is any insights on how legal framework in a country can help in or facilitate the data sharing, I think that'll be good. And also the second question was relating to the applicability of the global methodology or default values that IPCC guideline is using. This participant was highlighting the country context or geographical context as an African region. So if you can share some insights on how to make use of those global guidelines and make it reliable or applicable to the regional or country context, that will be the second question. And also there was some question regarding what is the difference between the simplified MRV and the complex MRV. I think this question you can highlight it. Maybe you can answer in the context of the process or institution arrangements that you just outlined. And there was also a question relating to the real objective of the Paris Agreement. I think I can quickly address this question because we are talking about the degree, like 2 degree or 1.5 degree. So basically, in the Article 2 of Paris Agreement, the objectives would be to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degree. Celsius degree above pre-industrial levels, and also in further it highlights that it further pursues efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. So I think that's where you get the references to the 2 degree or 1.5 degree in the literature or any other Paris Agreement related documents. So I hope that's pretty much straightforward. And yeah, so on the other 4 questions that I just read out loud, I hope Olia could get the questions, and if you can give us shed some light on these questions, that would be great.
Certainly. So I will begin from the legal framework and how it can help facilitating data sharing. That's an excellent question. Thank you for that, whoever asked it. So legal framework includes or may include the agreements, institutional agreements, which are legally binding. This is different from memorandum of understanding or letter of endorsement, which is not legally binding. So legal framework could include, for instance, something like a law or a rule which can be enforced within the country, and the compliance with this rule or the law is also inbuilt within the rule or the law. I can give you some examples of that. For instance, one example would be Climate Change Response Act that we have in New Zealand, which clearly identifies the Central Inventory Agency and outlines the responsibilities of other agencies in relation to data collection. The most important thing that would be most useful to overcome the data sharing barriers would be that the measures that the Central Inventory Agency can take if the situation like this occurs, like you're asking for the data and data provider refuses to give you the data. It's a really bad situation. You have to be able to handle it. So the legal framework could help because it would identify the compliance mechanisms that can be invoked in that particular case. For example, in the Climate Change Response Act that I just mentioned, the compliance mechanism includes the audits that the Central Inventory Agency has a right to perform in case the vendor is refusing to provide the activity data for the inventory. The ultimate fundament which underpins the legal framework in a sense of inventory data collection is that the Paris Agreement is national obligation, which means every single person in the country is responsible and has to oblige to do. So the country has to report, which means the Central Inventory Agency or other designated agency does it on behalf of every citizen of the country, and therefore has a right to ask and request each citizen of that country to comply with the national obligation. So other audits or some other actions that are built in the legal framework would be really very useful. If you don't have that legal framework in place, when you design it, make sure that compliance actions are a part of it, because otherwise it would be the line without teeth. Hopefully I answered that question. Now the next one, about applicability of default methodology and how it can be used reliably to the country context. So IPCC guidelines provide default emission factors for many categories, and those default emission factors often are split by geographical regions and by technologies to which they apply. So the main method to make those emission factors working for you is to carefully study which specific technology is used in your country and make sure that the emission factor you're picking up from the IPCC guidelines is designed for that particular technology. If you are not sure whether the match is right, it's the best idea to either inquire through the IPCC help desk or through ask the help from local experts or regional experts on that particular question, whether the technology applied for the country is comparable to the one which is involved in IPCC, which is described in IPCC guidelines, and whether the emission factor for that technology would be applicable to your country. As I mentioned before, geographical region is also important, especially for fuels, for calorific values of fuels, because it depends. I mean, the amount of emissions that can be produced from the use of one unit of fuel would depend on the climate zone where the fuel is used. The same goes for the sectors of the inventory which are more biologically focused, like agriculture, waste sector, and LULUCF. For all three sectors, you have to identify which climate zone the country resides in, or which climate zones. And if there are some emission factors for those sectors, they also linked to those climate zones or to specific geographic regions. So please be careful about it. And if in doubt, do the same as I mentioned before. Inquire from the help desk and ask the experts. Now, these emission factors are applicable, the default emission factors, for Tier 1 methods only. If you use Tier 2 methodology, it means that country-specific or technology-specific emission factors for your country exist. So make sure that if you decided to use Tier 2 methodologies, you're using country-specific parameters. For Tier 3 methodologies, you should be using plant-specific or field-specific parameters. So the level of granulation goes lower and lower and lower depending on which method you're using. And therefore, say for Tier 3 method, default emission factors cannot be used. Also, they cannot be used for Tier 2. Hopefully I answered that question. Now, the difference between simplified and complex MRV arrangements for the inventory. I really wish to talk to the author of that question in person, because that question can be answered in many different ways depending on the line of thought of the person who asked the question. The simplified arrangements, for example, could be just arrangements that govern the entire inventory from the top. For instance, the legal arrangements could be considered as simplified arrangements because they're applicable to the entire inventory, to the entire country. Or the top-level arrangements between the key institutions involved in the inventory. More complex arrangements would involve, in this case, arrangements related to specific actions, specific portions of the inventory system that are applied in the country. For example, roles and responsibilities in relation to QA and QC activities for a particular category or a part of the category, for a particular type of data, or for, say, a particular model. So it could be viewed that way. I strongly encourage the person who asked the question to come and talk to me during the workshop. We could dive into further details and really nail that question. Thank you. I think I'm finished with those questions, and Jihei kindly answered the objectives of Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olia. As she already put it quite straightforward, I mean, this webinar session is an introductory session, and it is good to see that participants are asking all those questions that would require more substantive or detailed discussions or interactions at the workshop. So this is as mentioned, this is the first phase of the training program. And the second part will be the homework. I'm going to ask Olia to provide some more information on this homework. But then the idea behind this introducing homework is that we want to make sure that the time you invest on this homework and also the webinar as a preparatory activities to the workshop would pay off, and then eventually at the in-person workshop you will be able to really enhance your knowledge and expertise. So basically, well, I can just give the floor to Olia to briefly walk us through this homework. What sort of things that are expected from the participants?
Okay, thank you. Right, so I will start from outlining 4 key tasks that underpin the entire homework. The first one is select a sector or better a category that you are most familiar with and where you have the biggest amount of information available. Then map the categories data activities, meaning just put the like shapes on the paper, showing which key activities are involved in total process of preparation inventory from this particular category, emphasizing the data collection, data processing, and data reporting. Then document the data sets within this map which are involved in the processes in these activities. And finally, rank data management challenges which are involved in collection, processing, and reporting of data from this particular category. So these are just the 4 key things that I want you to focus on. Now let's go into a bit greater detail. So this homework has been designed as an applied exercises. So you will use your existing knowledge of the country context, institutional arrangements, and that include the inventory data management processes. Your submitted homework will be used during day 1 of the CGE workshop to develop further the data maps and data types and identify the data suppliers, as well as discuss the data improvement techniques, approaches, and tools. As I mentioned before, first of all, you have to select a category. For example, you could select category energy industries from fossil fuel combustion, which is 1A1, and work with this. Or you could select a waste sector category or something else. So the next step would be, as mentioned before, you have to create a visual map that depicts how the data sets for this particular category flow for the data management steps. And those steps include identification of available data suppliers for the category, meaning identify and draw it in rectangles or circles where the key data for the category are coming from. Say, the data for energy industries could come from the power plants, from National Statistical Office, from data for power users, something like that. So those would be your first entities to include in the map. Then you will have to identify the data gaps. So if you don't know where the data is coming from, or where it goes to, or what happens with it in between, you need to identify it as a gap. I would suggest put like an empty circle in the place and put question mark and write a little note what exactly it is that you don't know. Then you will show how the data is collected, which processes are used, and how they are formatted for emissions calculations. So the data that you receive from the providers most likely is not exactly the data goes right into the method. For example, for many energy categories, you will receive invoices from customs or from different companies that show how many liters of, say, diesel or petrol, or how many tons of either of those have been bought. That doesn't mean you can use it immediately for the calculations. First, you have to transform them into some other data units that are useful for the methods. Then you have to identify how the quality control of the data has been performed, put it on your map, put the relevant processes of the map, and where those processes occurred. For example, the data producers would have the data control personnel or process that shows that the data that they give you is the good data. So mark it there. Or you have a QC process that checks if after processing the output data actually are still comparable with inputs. So there was no human error, accidental multiplying by 10 or dividing by 10, so it still looks reasonable, etc. Then you need to make sure that the uncertainty of the data also are measured and the relevant action is documented in your map. It's a good idea to show where the data are stored. Say, original data are received from the vendors. Somewhere in your system, they will be archived. Somewhere in the system, they will be put in the tables where they will be taken next for the next steps. So that is another thing that should be shown on the map. The same thing should be shown for the data that come out of the calculation process. So you calculated emissions. What happens next? You have those emission values. Where do you put them? Where do you store them? It's a good idea to put the relevant entity on the map and identify who is responsible for doing so. After the data are calculated, you will report them. Again, reporting is a separate process that should be put on the map. Responsibilities should be identified. So you can say, for example, the Central Inventory Agency will report the data. So the Central Inventory Agency should be shown in a circle or in a rectangle or whatever, and it should be linked to the data which are supposed to be reported. So this will create a visual map that tells you the story of what happened from the very beginning, from the point that you started collecting the data to the very end where the data is published. At the moment, it's a freestyle for formatting. You can do the maps whichever way you like, as long as it tells you story very clearly. It's a good idea to create that map and test it on somebody who was not involved in creation of it, to see if the other person can read your story and understand it. So all of this has to be submitted to the email address which is given to all participants. It's tisu@unfccc.int, or it could be submitted to Molly White, MOLLY.WHITE @ghginstitute.org. All of this is within the slide, so you can read it from there. So either way, we will receive this information, process it, and we will use it during the workshops. Ranking data management challenges. This is a slightly different thing. It's not the map. I suggest you will write down the list, just brainstorm the list of challenges that you might meet during the data management process, and then decide, okay, which one is the biggest for us, which one is the next biggest, etc. Alternatively, you could just mark them on 0 to 10 scale. Say 10 is the hardest, 0 is the easiest, and put the number near each challenge. So either way, you will have a very good idea which challenges you're facing the most or which ones are the hardest to you. Hopefully that makes it clear. If there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to those.
Thank you, Olia, for providing detailed explanations on how nominated experts can conduct their own homework. As mentioned, basically we would ask you to send us back this homework by 16th of August. Then we will collect all these inputs and homework from you, and then we'll process them and use that to further refine our training program. For example, your inputs relating to the specific categories or sectors, I think we're going to use that information for breaking out group exercises. And also, finally, I can also reiterate or reconfirm that we will be dealing with more in-depth substances. This webinar is just intended to be introductory to the workshop so that we can free up some time at the workshop and then use it for the hands-on exercise and also interactive discussions. Also, just before concluding this session, as mentioned earlier, we have recorded this session. So we will also make this link available to you, as well as we can also share this homework, which we already shared last week, but we can also send it to you for your easy reference. And if time permits, we would encourage you to go through this recorded session, especially when we know that few participants had some issues relating to the weak connection. So we would highly encourage you to go through the recording and be prepared for the homework as well as for the in-person workshop. And also in the meantime, if you have any questions on this presentation, homework, or if you want to share any expectations from the in-person workshops, please let us know. And the points of contact will be the email that you have been using for the registration and logistical arrangements, which is tisu@unfccc.int. With that, I think I would like to first wish to express our deep gratitude to you all for being with us for the last 2 hours, and especially to the distinguished speakers, Sandra and Olia, who have given us great information and also insights. I hope to see you all in Algeria in a month or 2 months' time. And we wish you a great day. Thank you so much for everyone for a great interactive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jihei.